This episode of Paradigm Profiles is called 9 Trey Gangsters, Godfather sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. On September 4, 2018, two high-ranking leaders of the 9 Trey Gangster Bloods, a subsidiary set of UBN, United Blood Nation, were each sentenced to 20 years in federal prison for racketeering conspiracy. Pedro Magoo Gutierrez, who is purported to be the godfather of the 9 Trey Gangsters, and James Frank White Baxton, who held the title of Worldwide High, a high-ranking title within the 9 Trey's leadership command, were ordered to serve these 20 years consecutively on top of the time they were already serving. California has always been ground zero and will always be ground zero with respects to being recognized as the official birthplace for most of these transnational gangs that have metastasized all over the country. Whether it's the Norteños, Sureños, Crips, or the Bloods, these gangs all evolved and originated in California. That's not to say that California gangs are any more realer than gangs on the East Coast, or that California gangs are harder or superior than any other gangs out there. There's gangsters and killers everywhere, on every coast, in every state, in every city, and in every hood. California is just where most of them started and has always been affectionately referred to as the gang capital of the world. This particular topic has been the subject of a lot of debates, especially in the realm of the Crips and the Bloods. Only because some of the Crips and Bloods on the East Coast have a difference in perspective about when and where certain things started. As far as the Norteños and Sureños go, that's something that can't be debated. Everyone knows that it started in California as a result of California being split in half by the Mexican Mafia and the Nuestra Familia's recruiting tactics. I don't want to delve off too deep into this subject and turn this into an East Coast, West Coast political debate. But for the purpose of doing this profile, I just want to say this. I'll be covering the Crips in an upcoming piece, and I'll be discussing some of their history and the origins of how and where they evolved. But for now, I want to concentrate on the Bloods. A while back, I watched an episode on InfoMinds Media, shout out to InfoMinds Media, where a well-known bounty hunter from Nickerson Gardens discussed the origins and history of the Bloods, the Bounty Hunters, the Pyrus, and UBN. This conversation between Nino Cappuccino and another well-known Blood from the East Coast named Mel Cross had a 3.5-hour discussion. Other Bloods tapped in and weighed in on the debate, and at times it got a little testy, but it wasn't so much the origins that they debated on. It seemed like it was more about some of the East Coast Bloods feeling like they weren't being given their due diligence, that they were being looked at as inferior to the West Coast Bloods. Some people might have their own opinion about this, and they're entitled to that. But like I said, I'm a realist, and I'm smart enough to know that geography doesn't dictate how real someone is or whether or not they're considered to be a real gangster. As far as the origins of 9 Trey Gangsters, also referred to as the Bentleys or the Billionaires, they evolved and were established in 1993 at the Rikers Island Jail Complex in New York City. Later, 9 Trey Gangsters got a lot of media attention because of the little rainbow-headed weirdo 6ix9ine's affiliation with the group. I'm not insinuating that 6ix9ine put the 9 Trey Gangsters on the map. We all know that this wasn't the case, and that he was just trying to use the gang as a way to gain street cred and clout. But truth be told, a lot of their worldwide exposure is attributed to that controversial Fruitcake's career as a wannabe rapper. Some people probably never even would have heard about them or their existence if you wouldn't have been associated with them. The two 9 Trey Gangsters that were sentenced in this indictment were two of the highest ranking members in the gang. Magoo was born and raised in the New York Bronx. Aside from establishing himself as the gang's godfather of the set, he also served as chairman of the UBN, two prominent positions that he respectfully held down. Growing up in the Bronx transformed Magoo into the type of hardcore gang member that he would later become. It not only hardens you and your character, but it also hardens your exterior. The things you see, the things you become involved in, and the people you hang around all contribute to what type of individual you eventually become. You become a product of your environment. It would have been tough on any kid back in the 70s and 80s growing up in the Bronx. The Bronx was a lot different back in those days. It looked like a dilapidated war zone. Many of the buildings back then were abandoned and served as drug spots. And the city did nothing about it. By the age of 17, Magoo became a member of the Trigger Finger Posse, which was a Bronx gang that allegedly trafficked high levels of drugs and was known for allegedly killing 7 people in the early 90s. This was a violent Bronx gang that earned a lot of respect in the Bronx. Not long after turning 17, Magoo ended up getting arrested for an armed robbery, which would result in him making his introduction into Rikers Island. Even Rikers Island was a different place back in those days. Not just in terms of the jail environment, but also in terms of the caliber of inmates and the type of officers who worked at the jail. After several months of being locked up, he would eventually be released and return to the streets of the Bronx, where he'd end up getting arrested 5 more times. The last arrest was for murder, where he allegedly shot 4 people, in which one would ultimately die. Locked up with the fresh murder charge, Magoo would return back to Rikers Island, but this time, when he returned, it would be as a Latin king. This information was confirmed by many of his first generation Bloods, as well as Latin King members themselves who have done interviews on different YouTube channels. At some point, while waiting to go to trial for his murder charge, Magoo somehow fell out of favor with the Latin Kings, and depending on who you ask, he would end up either leaving or getting expelled from the gang. During this same time, while awaiting trial, Magoo would also end up in the hole for slashing 4 other inmates and being caught in possession of weapons a total of 7 times. During this stay in the Bing, or the gang module as it was called back in those days, Magoo would come into contact with some of the original New York City Bloods. At the time, the Bloods were just a group of several African American inmates who had bonded together to protect themselves from the Latino gangs that were dominating the jail. Over time, Magoo would end up gaining the trust and acceptance of the Bloods by pointing out, setting up, targeting, and putting in work against some of the Latino inmates that would also make their way to the Bing. After he proved his loyalty and put in enough work against other opposing Latino gangs he came into contact with, Magoo, along with another individual named Wildcat, became 2 of the first Bloods of Latin descent to be recruited into the Bloods. They would be recruited by some of the other Bloods who were housed with them in the Bing. In March of 1994, Magoo was paroled and brought home by another high-ranking Blood named S.I., who was another legendary high-ranking member of the 9 Trey Gangsters. Not too long after coming home, S.I. was allegedly shot and killed by the police in August of 2015. Not long after turning Blood, Magoo was convicted of second-degree murder in 1996 and sentenced to 26 years to life. As time passed, a bunch of different Blood sets, who all fell under the UBN umbrella, would start to go through power struggles. Certain set leaders began to want more than others. The typical kind of power struggles that all gangs and their leaderships go through. This is the jostling and maneuvering that takes place in some of the trenches, with some of the more shrewd gang leaders or those aspiring to be part of the leadership. Little beefs and rifts would start to take place. This type of infighting is actually necessary in order for the gangs to constantly regenerate and weed out the weak links. Over time, some sets would leave or get kicked out of the UBN because they either wanted to become independent and stand alone, or they just no longer felt like they should be a subordinate to the UBN. Some of these sets felt as if they had earned their own right to dictate and control their own, and because of their dominance in the streets, they elected to leave the UBN alliance. UBN, however, seen this as a calling to begin restructuring itself into a more organized and structured group. The COC, or the Chain of Command, was also revised using a ranking system from lowest to highest. The lowest in rank was a scrap, or a soldier, equivalent to a street soldier. Then you had a 1-star general through a 5-star general, low, high, and Godfather. Other positions within the rank included chairman of the hood or the set that individual belonged to. Magoo was appointed to act as a chairman for the 9 Trey Gangsters, and he held this prestigious position down amongst other high-ranking positions such as the Godfather. To understand a little more about the ranking system and how other Bloods drew a distinction between Bloods who had committed themselves to UBN and those that stayed true to their set, you have to understand the term or meaning of cut. If a blood was asked if he was cut or not cut, he was basically being asked if he was a member of the UBN. No cut meant that you were not affiliated with UBN, that you were 100% blood from whatever set you belonged to, and that you stayed true to tribal loyalty. If you identified yourself as being cut, this meant that you were affiliated with the UBN and that you were no longer 100% just from your neighborhood. This is commensurable or comparable to dope that has been cut with some type of cutting agent. Same concept, pure dope over dope that has been cut and stepped on. By this time, Magoo was well within his bit of state. He had settled into the system and his role as a leader, but because of him constantly getting written up, he'd end up spending most of his time in the lockups, away from the everyday dealings of the general population. Magoo's name would be held in high regards as he maintained a high-ranking position in the gang for years. In 2003, he'd eventually become a head or the chairman of the UBN, a position supposedly given to him by SI when he was getting released from state prison. Now, in order to understand the gravity and procedure of that position, you have to understand the Bloods on the East Coast and how they operate. Even though they're technically a street gang, the Bloods started in prison, and that's where they maintain most of their power. So being the head of the Bloods in prison, where most of the moves were being made, actually made Magoo one of the, if not the most powerful men in the New York State prison system. Many of the original UBN sets, like 9 Trey, G-Shine, and even Sex Money Murder, are independent now, and they have sanctioned sets in different states down south. And this is where the last chapter of Magoo's story takes place. In May of 2017, he was part of an 83-person federal indictment out of North Carolina. This indictment netted Blood members from various ranks and status. It wasn't just focused primarily on leadership, as most RICO indictments usually have been in the past. It was a mixture of both street-level soldiers and the leaders at the top. Another longtime Blood leader that was also indicted was Omari Uno B. Rizzero, who held the leadership position of High and was temporarily appointed the position as acting godfather of the entire UBN. As a godfather in the United Blood Nation gang, he was considered the highest authority in the nationwide organization. It was a long climb for 41-year-old Uno B. Starting out as a member of the 9 Trey Gangsters, a subset of the United Blood Nation, he paid his dues and devoted his entire life to the gang. He went from a scrap to becoming a 5-star general, onto a low, then a high, until he eventually rose to the very top, Godfather of the United Blood Nation, UBN. As Godfather, he led what once started out as a prison gang in 1993 and now has transformed into a violent criminal organization operating throughout the East Coast with thousands of members. The group is governed by a common set of 31 rules, known as the 31, which were originally written by the founders of the UBN. The 31 are equivalent to the 14 bonds for the Nuestra Raza, or the NF Constitution. It constitutes their rules, regulations, and all the policies that are governed within the UBN. Members are expected to conduct themselves and their illegal activity according to rules and regulations set by their leaders. Prominent among these is a requirement to pay monthly dues to the organization, often in the amounts of $31 or $93. These guys are lucky. This is chump change. The Nuestra Familia requires all those within their organization and all those working as subordinates to pay $200 regardless of the member's financial status. But this is also based on the size of these two organizations. The NF is a lot smaller, so for the UBN, $31 or $93 collectively probably amounts to tens of thousands of dollars. A percentage of these funds are then transferred to incarcerated UBN leadership in New York, among them Uno B. These funds are used locally to conduct gang business. Gang dues are derived from illegal activities such as drug trafficking, robberies, wire fraud, and bank fraud, among other forms of illegal racketeering activities. The parallels between these East Coast and West Coast gangs are so similar that you'd almost think that these guys took a page out of the West Coast's playbook. I'm not saying that they did, but it's ran almost identical. The NF, MA, BGF, and even the AB operate the same way. Some of the money generated from illegal activities on the streets is siphoned back into the prisons or to the leadership of these groups. This is a state of becoming self-sustaining or self-solvent. The rest of the money is banked and utilized to purchase more drugs, guns, and other materials needed in order to maintain the street establishments and to keep breaking new ground. Confronted with the government's full judicial power, on March 12, 2018, Uno B and 34 other UBN bosses, members, and associates pleaded guilty to racketeering conspiracy and related charges in North Carolina, including drug trafficking, wire fraud, firearm possession, and the use of a firearm in furtherance of a crime of violence and drug trafficking. In a recorded jail call, Uno B admitted to being together with Magoo and Frank White, the last ones that God put in power over the UBN. He conducted gang business and participated in the distribution of gang dues while incarcerated in the New York State Department of Corrections. In order to communicate with the outside, he used 35-year-old Portia Talina Rosero, nicknamed Lady Uno B, for obvious reasons. She maintained a Facebook account through which private messages were sent from Uno B to other blood leaders. She pleaded guilty to racketeering conspiracy and admitted to participating in the distribution of gang dues and a phone call during which Uno B stated that a suspected cooperator would be faded straight up. In addition to Uno B and Lady Uno B, 7 other defendants with high-ranking leadership positions have previously pleaded guilty in this investigation. Montrea Hardbody Atkinson from Raleigh, North Carolina, who held the rank of high. Adrian Gotti Coker from Gastonia, North Carolina, who held the position of low. Quincy Black Montana Haynes from Lawndale, North Carolina, who held the position of low. Barrington Bandana Lataberderi from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, who held the position of high. Bianca Lady Guns Harrison from Midway Park, North Carolina, who held the position of high. McQuan Drips Nelson from Charlotte, North Carolina, who held the position of low. And Twilane Five Alive Wilson from Shelby, North Carolina, who held the position of low. This indictment wiped out a big part of a networking system that UBN had established in North Carolina and succeeded in hindering UBN's forward progress. Lady Guns, one of the only ranking females that is part of UBN's leadership structure, was Magoo's and Frank White's longtime preferred visitor. She was responsible for facilitating most of their communications, but like all other criminal organizations, UBN will eventually recuperate and reorganize itself. Most of the 83 defendants in this indictment would end up pleading out, but Magoo, with little to lose, decided to go to trial. Already in jail for over 25 years for the murder he was convicted for in 1996, he would now be facing another 25 years to life in the feds for his role in this new indictment. In the indictment, the feds say that as the godfather of the set, Magoo conducted gang business and participated in the distribution of gang dues while incarcerated in the New York Department of Corrections. He also ordered a gang war in North Carolina in 2011, where he directed members of UBN Bloods to attack and kill a renegade blood set called Pretty Tony. This renegade blood set, Pretty Tony, tried claiming its independence and then began working in contrast to UBN. As a result, Magoo greenlighted the whole set and had UBN move on anyone who was associated, connected, or affiliated with Pretty Tony. The Pretty Tony Blood Gang was the Bloods version of the Hoovers. There was a lot of them, they were deeply rooted in their neighborhood, and they were respected by all the other East Coast blood sets. The war resulted in numerous injuries among other inmates and the lockdown of 5 North Carolina prisons for 6 months. Magoo refused to cop out and ended up going to trial for the racketeering charges he was facing. He really didn't think he had any real chances of beating the case. For him, it was more about just staying where he was at and stretching things out. After a tumultuous 2-week trial, Magoo was found guilty and got slammed across the board. In September of 2018, he was sentenced to an additional 20 years in federal prison. Currently, he is in Florence ADX with a release date of 2036. Some people have tried to slander Magoo's character, saying that he was a rogue Latin king and that he jumped ship and switched up hood jumping from a Latin king to a blood. Others have said that Magoo stayed loyal until he was turned on and betrayed, and that it was only then that he waged war and turned against his former clique. Either way, no matter how it happened, there's nothing to substantiate it, and there's never been nothing concrete that has ever surfaced about it. Magoo has never addressed it before either. But the one thing that there seems to be no question about is that Magoo did a lot for the UBN, and that he gave up his life for the growth and advancement of UBN. This latest trial is just another example of it. According to court documents and evidence presented at the trial, the UBN is a violent criminal street gang operating throughout the East Coast since it was founded as a prison gang in 1993. UBN members are often identified by the use of the color red and can also be identified by common tattoos or burn marks. Examples include a three-circle pattern usually burned onto the upper arm, known as a dog paw. The acronym MOB, which stands for Member of Bloods, the words Damu or Eastside, the number 5, the 5-pointed star, and the 5-pointed crown. UBN members have distinct hand signs and written codes, which are used to identify other members and rival gang members. The 9-Trey gangster set of the UBN refers to themselves as Billies. As I said, the UBN is governed by a common set of 31 rules, known as the 31, which were originally written by the founders, Omar Porti and Leonard McKenzie. Members of the UBN are expected to conduct themselves and their illegal activity according to the rules and regulations by their leaders. Like I said, prominent among these is a requirement to pay monthly dues to the organization, often in the amounts of less than $100. A percentage of these funds are transferred to incarcerated UBN leadership in New York. These funds also are used locally to conduct gang business. UBN gang dues are derived from illegal activity performed by subordinate UBN members, including narcotics trafficking, robberies, wire fraud, bank fraud, extortion, and other forms of illegal racketeering activities. The East Coast Bloods and the West Coast Bloods are diametric when it comes to their stilo and how they move. But when it comes to operating established criminal organization, there's a lot of parallels. Since Death Row Records was founded in 1991 by Suge Knight, co-founder Michael, Harry O'Harris, and Dick Griffey, the Bloods and their influence spread like wildfire. Before 1991, the Crips were a dominant force across the country and outnumbered the Bloods by epic proportions. There's no question about the fact that Suge Knight led the movement and rallied the Blood car to grow exponentially. Blood sets all over the West Coast were growing in numbers, and this multi-million-dollar record label created a fad. 2 years later, in 1993, that's when the East Coast began identifying with blood gangs, and this is when the UBN was founded. Ironically, whether people want to acknowledge this or not, a lot of the networking between the East Coast and the West Coast Bloods was championed through rap music and the rap industry. Even though a lot of the rappers that were fronting themselves as real Bloods and who were claiming that they came from the streets and that they were really banging, most of these guys were frauds. Truth be told, they were studio gangsters who had never really seen a day of gangbanging in their lives. They were nothing more than conduits. It was the hired help, the goons, who were hired as bodyguards and who were really from hoods like Fruittown Pyrus, Looters Park Pyru, Black Pea Stones, Family Swan Bloods, Pacoima Pyru Bloods, Pueblo Bishop Bloods, and the Bounty Hunter Bloods from the Nickerson Gardens are just some of the few blood sets that had a lot to do with it. The rap industry was generating a lot of money, but this was nothing more than a purpose for traveling from coast to coast. The real money was in the dope game, and a lot of these guys seen the potential that was right at their fingertips. These were the guys that started networking behind the scenes, the real street dudes that were gamed up and who tapped into these markets. Real West Coast Bloods ran into real East Coast Bloods, and then the doors started opening. Even that little weirdo 6ix9ine started a movement. Trust me, I can't stand the sight of the dude, and I don't like giving him no credit. But when he jumped on that 9-Trey gangster bandwagon and put that setup under the spotlight, It opened up a lot of doors for these guys. Nobody gave two shits about 6ix9ine. This was evident by how that relationship ended and how his so-called manager Shotty made it clear that they were just using him. But the little rainbow-headed weirdo created a blood movement. He put them on the world stage and created another booming fad. The Game out of Nickerson Gardens and YG from Compton are other Bloods who seen the potential that the East Coast had to offer as well. Although it was brief, the Game linked up with 50 Cent and even signed with him in the G Unit. Behind the scenes, they started working with other East Coast artists, but again, it wasn't these guys who were bridging these gaps. It was their camps and the hired help. And no matter how much you might not like the guy because of his controversial antics, Wack 100 has networked with a lot of different East Coast Bloods and artists. In fact, Wack 100 signed with one of the biggest labels out there, Cash Money Records. I don't know what they see in this other fruitcake Blueface, but he was able to convince Birdman to sign him. Like I said, I can't take nothing away from Wack 100 because he's making a lot of money and he's making it work for him. But despite his best efforts, he'll never have the ability to do what Suge Knight did. I know he's trying, and I know he thinks he's the next Suge Knight, but it's never gonna happen. In closing, I think if they're smart, the East Coast and the West Coast Bloods will only keep building off of what they already have established, and that they'll only continue to get stronger. They have a lot of potential and a lot of opportunities between each other, so these next 10 years could get real interesting. I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode of Paradigm Profiles. We have more content that should be dropping this week, including the other 2 parts of that running Q&A. We've been trying to get more content out to you guys, and for those of you who are into Paradigm's audiobooks, we've been trying to stay consistent on releasing more chapters as well. Hopefully, you guys have noticed. Also, if you guys aren't subscribed to our Patreon page, you might want to subscribe ASAP, as this is where we release all the content that YouTube flags and doesn't allow us to show. In the next few days, we're going to be revamping our Patreon page, so you guys might want to think about getting on. Moving on, if there's an area you guys see we might need improvement on, by all means, please feel free to address it so that we can make the necessary adjustments. We're always trying to find new ways to improve our channel, so don't hesitate to address it. Also, remember, we have the Jordan shoe raffle coming up. Unlimited $3 buy-in for whatever size Jordan you wear, and unlimited $5 buy-in for a 4X old school red derby. Get your tickets in now, either through a super chat during one of our lives or through one of our apps, CASHAPP or VENMO. Good luck to you all. You guys enjoy the rest of your day, and as always, we extend our appreciation to all of you who have continued to stick with us and who have helped us maintain this positive platform. Without you, the viewers, we would cease to exist.